Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the April 11th, 2023 Planning Commission meeting. We have 7 discussion items on the agenda today. I would ask the commissioners to hold all questions until the conclusion of all presentations and any public comments. We start every meeting with the opportunity for the public to comment on an item that is not contained on the agenda. Are there any members of the public who would wish to speak on an item that is not contained on the agenda? Seeing none, I'm going to move on to the consent agenda. There are 2 items on the consent agenda. A vote on these items determines future scheduling and does not designate a recommendation on the details of the case. There are 2 items. Item C.2, rezoning Z6022 on South Boylan Ave and Hargett Street. And item C.3, which is rezoning Z9022 on Rock Quarry and Diamond Drive. For the first item, Z6022, City Council has authorized a 45-day extension for the review of this case. The new deadline for action is July 6th. This item will be referred, I believe, to the April Committee of the Whole meeting. Is that correct? Or are we taking it back to the June? 22nd. To the June 22nd. Thank you. Item C.3 is rezoning Z9022. The applicant has requested additional time to allow coordination on the outstanding issue related to the existing community well on adjacent parcels. Staff recommends the commission request an 80-day extension for review. We can take one motion to approve both items of the consent agenda. With that, do I have a motion?
I'll move to approve rezoning Z6022 to be heard at the June 22nd COW meeting and Z9022 to be extended for 80 days. Excellent.
And do we have a second? Commissioner Rains has offered a motion for approval of the consent agenda. Commissioner Bennett has offered a second. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, by show of hands, those in favor? And any opposed? That motion passes unanimously. Moving on to the committee report, we have rezoning Z4722 on Computer Drive. This is a request to rezone approximately 4.66 acres from office mixed use 3 stories with Special Highway Overlay District 1 and Special Highway Overlay District 2 to office mixed use 12 stories conditional use with Special Highway Overlay District 2. This item was discussed at the March 23rd Committee of the Whole meeting, where the committee voted the item out to the full commission with no recommendation and a request to defer the item until the commission took action on the associated comprehensive plan amendment CP 223 for the Midtown Bridge. We recommended approval of CP 223 at our meeting on March 28th. If there's additional update, we have Hannah Reckow.
Good morning. The only update I have on the comprehensive plan amendment is that it will be scheduled beyond the City Council's next agenda to schedule the hearing for that request. There's no update on this case.
Excellent, thank you. I believe based on when the deadline for action on the case is, we can either vote this one forward now or hear it at our next meeting. What is the will of the commission? Seeing no commentary, I'd like to entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion.
Excellent, thank you.
Thanks, Chair Fox. Let's see, for zoning case Z4722, I move to recommend adoption of the proposed consistency statement dated April 11th, 2023, contained in the agenda materials, and to recommend approval of the zoning amendment. This amendment also includes an amendment to the future land use map to the extent described in the adopted consistency statement. The action taken is reasonable and in the public interest because it would increase entitlement for housing and employment to locate near existing transportation infrastructure, including the location of a proposed multimodal bridge connecting across I-440.
Thank you. And do we have a second?
Second.
Commissioner Dattell has offered a motion to recommend approval of Z4722. Commissioner O'Haver has offered a second. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion?
I plan to vote against this without any considerations for urban frontage or any kind of addressing of the street.
Thank you. If there's no additional comment, we'll call the vote on that. By show of hands, those in favor? And any opposed? That motion passes with one opposed. Moving on, there is one item listed under old business today, that is Z8022 on Corporate Center Drive and Play Golf Way. The applicant has requested a deferral of this item until our April 25th meeting. So without objection, we will defer this item to April 25. Moving on to new business, there are 5 items under the new business agenda today. These requests have not been previously discussed, so we will hear a full staff presentation and an applicant presentation and hear from any members of the public. The first item is rezoning Z8822 on Kindley Street. This is a request to rezone approximately 6.74 acres from downtown mixed use 20 stories to downtown mixed use 40 stories with conditions. We will start with a staff presentation by Hannah Recco.
All right, good morning again. So this is a request to rezone about 3 parcels, just under 7 acres, from downtown mixed use 20 stories to downtown mixed use 40 stories conditional use. So this is sort of on the border between where there is downtown mixed use zoning and other mixed use and residential zoning districts. Location-wise, this is on the south part of downtown, right near the interchange of McDowell Street and Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. South of there is Washington Elementary School. Oops. A zoom in on the site, you can see the current parcel boundaries do bisect the structure that's there at the end of Kindley Street. A rail line going sort of north-south is a corridor where commuter rail is being studied. Nearby uses are primarily office buildings. And this is just a view from the closest right-of-way at the end of Kindley Street. The site also borders directly McDowell Street, so the portion of this area here is part of the site. There is one proposed condition which prohibits a few uses normally allowed in DX. And the change really here is an increase in height. So that increases across the board entitlement, residential units, office, and other commercial uses. You know, the site is in downtown, so has access to good infrastructure. So walk, transit, and bike scores are higher than average, and it has a high proximity to jobs because of its location. It does not include any guaranteed subsidized units, but would overall increase the amount of housing units that could locate on the site, and is within walking distance of transit. The census tract that this site is in, the residents are more likely to be racial minority, low income, or have less than a high school education. And the median gross rent has increased much faster than the city average. And I'll note the census tract does start sort of at the site and go south to give you a sense of the geographic area that that's referring to. Future land use map designation is central business district, which does recommend up to 40 stories in height. So the request is consistent with that guidance. The urban form guidance would recommend an urban frontage here. The request does not include one, so it is inconsistent with the urban form guidance. But consistent overall with the comprehensive plan. A number of downtown policies are consistent in this case, and then a few more. And then really the inconsistency here is the lack of frontage included in the request. So that concludes the overview. Your deadline for action is in later this summer. Answer any questions you have.
Thank you. Next, we will hear from the applicant team. The applicant and those in support have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair Fox, members of the Planning Commission, Samuel Morris with Longleaf Law Partners, 4509 Creedmoor Road, Suite 302, here on behalf of the applicant. Thank you also, Hannah, for giving that presentation of the case. So yeah, on a high level, this is a just under 7-acre assemblage located in downtown Raleigh. The current use is just that single office building located on the property. It fronts both McDowell and Martin Luther King, but obviously that Kindley Street extension does come down, and as you'll see in a moment, part of these plans are to continue that Kindley Street extension, so that will ultimately kind of bisect this assemblage. Current zoning is DX20, located in the central business district, as well as that downtown urban form designation, frequent transit, close proximity to planned BRT routes. So that is what justifies our request to increase the height to 40 stories. Here's a look at the property. Just I'm sure some of you are probably aware, this is the city gateway site. There's been a couple different iterations of what development here might look like. It's kind of the classic postcard view of Raleigh as you come in from that southern gateway. You'll notice, differing from prior projects and iterations of this plan, what is now former DOT property is included. That has been abandoned by the NCDOT and obtained by the developers and will be folded into the larger city gateway project. You'll also notice that 2 of the parcels are not included in the rezoning. Those have been conveyed out and will be developed under current zoning. Here's just a higher view to show you proximity to downtown and relationship to Dix Park over in the west. As you heard, current zoning is DX20. This is notable because as you see this assemblage and as well as some of the parcels to the north, these are some of the only DX parcels in the city that do not have an urban frontage already existing on them. When the city remapped 10 years ago or so, as you kind of saw, the context along McDowell Street and Martin Luther King aren't exactly conducive to an urban form and arguably pose, safety issues, and as we'll talk later, development issues with requiring build-tos and the kind of typical urban frontage requirements along what are essentially highways right now. So we think that is why there's no frontage included 10 years ago when these were originally mapped, and plays into why we haven't just categorically included a frontage on this large parcel as part of this rezoning request. Future land use map is, of course, central business district, falling kind of on the southern edge of the central business district and moving towards what's that larger community mixed use district where you find Park City South and some other developments that have been approved recently to the south. Urban form is, of course, in that downtown section, close proximity to BRT and transit stations. And so, yeah, here is the subdivision plan for the assemblage that includes, importantly, this extension of Kindley Street to Martin Luther King. Before the NCDOT property was acquired, this wasn't really possible from the developer side to accomplish this, but now that has been. As you'll see, there are some grading challenges, but this extension is going to happen. It's going to be an Avenue 2 lane undivided running through the majority of the parcel and then hitting Martin Luther King and splitting into the turn lanes and improvements that you see there, which have been put together by Ramey Kemp. I'll also note that other roadway improvements, bike ped improvements will be done along South McDowell and MLK. South McDowell is an Avenue 6 lane divided, so that requires above curb, bike, and ped. Martin Luther King is actually going to be a BRT 4 lane, so there'll be a BRT running through the middle, 2 lanes on each side, and again above curb, bike and ped. And then finally, as part of the subdivision, we have agreed to connect MLK to Kinley Street with a bike ped connection along the rail line property. So there will be, full connection like this, if you can imagine it. Full roadway improvement there, and like that. So you'll have, although, as we'll discuss in a moment, a lack of traditional urban frontage on those streets, we do think that, there will be substantial improvement to the conditions that are existing right now, which is no sidewalks, along South McDowell, and like we said, in putting in bike lanes as well, we think will greatly improve the kind of pedestrian experience on those roads. Mentioned this briefly earlier, but just to put it into context, the grading on the site is very unique because of the NCDOT projects over the years that have come and put in these exit ramps and turn lanes and whatnot. This maybe shows you better. It's kind of essentially that Martin Luther King exit has cut a deep kind of valley through the property. And just to show you, this is going to result in some large grading efforts that are going to have to occur on the property in order to make this buildable and in order to make that Kinley Street extension happen. Here's another kind of more aerial postcard view of Raleigh, and you can see the site and kind of see that grading along South McDowell and where the bridge along Martin Luther King, and as Hannah explained, the property does include all the way up to the bridge and will go across like that. So the grading situation is quite unique on the property. And again, yeah, here you go. That's what it looks like from South McDowell. I mean, you're looking at, over the course of 30 or 40 feet, a very substantial height increase. And then here's that MLK exit, which is now private property, and this will be part of the development. So when you look at the kind of unique grading, the unique kind of traffic circumstances, we'll just go back to address the primary inconsistency with urban form. Again, we think, it was zoned for 20 stories without an urban frontage, we think intentionally by the city of Raleigh 10 years ago. So keeping that in mind, that's kind of where we come from. Applying a categorical urban frontage to this large parcel will kind of have the unintended consequence of pushing those buildings up against MLK and South McDowell in a way that's, in our mind, undesirable and arguably undesirable from a safety standpoint. Our preference, and when you look at the parcel, the preference would be to push buildings and encourage urban form along Kinley Street as opposed to MLK and South McDowell. So that's our intention. That's the way we view the property. And so that's our response to the urban form, but we're certainly happy to and interested in hearing the commission's comments about how to address urban form on this kind of large and complicated property. So with that, we appreciate your time and happy to answer any questions you all have. Thank you.
Thank you. Want to check in and see if there are any members of the public who wish to speak on this item? Okay. Seeing none, I'll open it for questions and comments from commissioners. Commissioner Raines?
Thanks, Chair Fox. Question for staff. On the staff report, there was a comment about adjacent site plan, build a section of a path to connect to the planned project. Then it notes the applicant could offer a condition offering an easement to facilitate this connection. Could staff expand on that and maybe point it out on a map what this connection is? And
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. If you know it.
You can help me find our slides for this. That's is it? Okay. Jason Myers with Raleigh Transportation. I'm gonna try to pick a, this may be the best, an aerial photo. So the Southern Gateway Corridor Plan that was adopted by the city recommended a grade separated crossing in this location here, between basically the hill on one side of MLK and a hill on the other side of MLK next to Washington Elementary. Fayetteville Street coming northbound comes down to MLK, and there's kind of hills on either side. It did not design that, but it did recommend that we build this crossing. And the idea being that Kindley Street kind of connects into the downtown grid, you know, to cross. That's not what I thought I was going to do. Sorry. That by crossing over onto this street that is not nearly as busy as the Dawson-McDowell connector or Wilmington Street, it helps provide access for Washington Terrace, for a lot of the Carolee neighborhood, and kind of helps reduce the barrier that MLK is to walking into downtown Raleigh from the south. So to zoom in a little bit on this site, the site plan for and I'm just going to generally circle it. This is not the boundary of the site plan, but there's a site under development here, and it has an easement and a path kind of along the railroad here. It points at this little flag of the subject property, which is mostly along the side of the hill. Now, the subdivision that has been submitted but not yet approved does show an easement in that area, but given that that subdivision is not approved, it could be changed. You know, there may be something about that would change. And it's also, you know, not to get too into the weeds and the details, but all of this is pointing at very much to be here only, and potentially a little bit of flexibility to cross in something more like that might be a better facility. But as I said, it's not something that the city has been able to do any preliminary planning on that. And so the suggestion was that anything to help facilitate closing the gap in this part of the property between the easement that's already under construction with the adjacent site plan and the other side of MLK is going to be beneficial to achieving that goal from the Southern Gateway Plan. Does that answer the questions of the commission?
thank you.
I have a question for the applicant. So have you considered providing that easement?
Yes, so we have showed that on the pending subdivision plan. We have showed the extension on that, but like Jason said, that hasn't been approved, so we're not legally bound in perpetuity. To the extent the commission would like to see it, we'd be happy to include that as a rezoning condition. We're very confident that our subdivision will be approved, but to the extent there's any one that memorialized here through a rezoning condition, the development team's happy to do that.
Okay, excellent. And then while you're there, I'd also like to talk about the urban condition on Kindley Street. The lack of a frontage on, say, the McDowell side isn't really necessarily of concern to me, but Kindley itself, and then the eastern side of where Kindley hits MLK, I believe those edges could probably warrant some conditions that mimic an urban frontage, specifically limiting things like parking between the curb and the front of the building.
Absolutely. Yes, that's part of why we wanted to come here and hear your impressions before we took our first bite at the apple regarding, you know, some type of hybrid frontage conditions along Kindley Street. So yes, particularly along Kindley Street, like you said, prohibiting parking, ensuring pedestrian access, pushing buildings up along the street. That's something we are very interested in doing and happy to take a stab at some rezoning conditions that do that. If there's any specifics beyond that, we'd be happy to hear that. I know MLK, you mentioned too, at least particularly the eastern kind of portion of MLK might be more challenging, but happy to take a close look at that and come back with a better answer on whether that's possible.
Excellent. And Commissioner O'Haver, did you have a question?
Why just the east side?
Well, I'm looking at the grade, and when you look at the subdivision plat, can you pull back up your map with the?
Presentation. Appreciate it. Yeah.
So the east side, from where Kindley hits at the bottom on MLK, going over towards Plan Right, or Plan Right.
Yeah.
Plan Left, I believe there's a grade change there associated with the infrastructure of MLK. Is that correct?
Yes, that's where the bridge. Sorry, I don't mean to jealous you, but you can kind of see it here. That the bridge is located kind of right along there, so your grade is difficult. I know it's hard to kind of imagine the infrastructure being pushed up to where that property line is, but yeah, along that Plan West side, there's a significant drop off. That's not present on the east side.
Can you go back? Yeah, that right there. Where's that tying into?
Where does Kindley hit on like the aerial? That would be
Yes.
helpful, just approximately.
So let's go back to it's going to connect right here to that.
Commissioner Otwell, did you have a question?
I was just curious what's going to happen to the westbound Martin Luther King traffic that's going north on 70. Like, we're taking away the slip lane, the exit lane. Maybe Mr. Myers or whoever is familiar with what this intersection is going to look like.
Yeah, that's a good question. Jason Myers of Transportation. So what's going to happen is the existing kind of partial signal here at MLK and I guess it's McDowell Street on and off ramp is going to be converted into a full movement intersection. So coming from Kindley, you'll be able to go straight, left, or right, and straight will take you around and back onto McDowell. It is not one of the higher volume movements right now. Excuse me. And there will also be the ability to turn right onto Kindley Street and enter downtown from MLK using Kindley Street as well. It's been something that's been studied a fair amount through TIAs from previous development proposals here and kind of stemming from the Southern Gateway Corridor study.
I would also like to support what Chair Fox had to say about urban frontage or some kind of conditions approximating urban frontage on Kindley Street. And I'd like to have a discussion about, I don't feel it's appropriate to require an urban frontage along South McDowell Street and portions of MLK Boulevard. But I'm concerned that a sidewalk and a bike lane here along these two long block faces with no kind of interface with any kind of urban setting would create an isolated and potentially threatening space for people to be, especially at night here on these corners. And I was wondering if there, if not a full urban form, some kind of conditions guaranteeing at least some connections to the property through those sides of the block face for those pedestrian and bicycle spaces.
Would the applicant like to respond to that?
Certainly, and I might just ask for a clarification. So yeah, you mentioned the kind of difficulty in providing bike and ped along these, given the traffic context. Was the final point you said connections to other adjacent private properties?
No, I'm concerned that a bicycle or a sidewalk property that comes here on South McDowell Street or along Martin Luther King would be very isolated. We run into those problems on the Greenway Trail where there's not a lot of entrances and exits, and lots of users feel vulnerable and unsafe when they're in those kind of situations with no escape and no way to communicate and kind of stuck in like a transportation corridor where there's nowhere to go. Just an entrance or a sidewalk.
Just like breaking up the frontage along McDowell and just having like a mid-block connection into the property. Is that what you're recommending?
Maybe pedestrian or bicycle access there, not a full graded driveway.
Okay. yes, that's something we can certainly look into.
Go ahead.
I'm just, I guess this isn't really part of the rezoning, but I'm curious if staff could address, or maybe the applicant, about tree conservation. You know, that whole area along the slip lane there is vegetated. I know there's a lot of grading to go in there. Is TCA being met somewhere else on the site?
This site has actually gotten a TCA variance because of the massive regrading that's going to have to happen in order to basically fix or whatever, grade that ramp. Those trees were planted when the NCDOT did their infrastructure improvements. And so the property owners in the past year have, understanding once they acquired the NCDOT property, came into the BOA and got a variance from the TCA requirements. They did essentially pay a replacement fee for all the trees that would have stayed but are going to be removed. They've paid or paying the city a replacement fee and will be recouped based on however many trees they're able to actually save when the grading process. There's so much uncertainty with regards to the grading on the site. In the downtown context, they were very concerned about their ability to conserve the trees, and that's why they did get that variance. But like I said, have paid a replacement fee and will make best efforts to recoup that through actually meeting the TCA requirements to the best of their ability.
Commissioner Lampman, did you have a question?
I just feel like this is a very challenged site in a number of ways, with the commuter rail, the trees, the McDowell, Martin Luther King. This is a major connection point for a lot of people getting to major areas of the city. So if we put 40 stories here in highly dense living, do we have any idea of, did we do a traffic study? I mean, how, do we know anything from a transportation standpoint as to how the level of congestion might impact this particular area and how the traffic flow is just such a key access point to the city? I just don't know if transportation has been engaged at any particular level right now at this stage, or what your level of engagement would be in site plan review.
Yeah, that's a good question. There has been, as I said earlier, a lot of study about this change of configuration that we've been talking about that's not really a part of the rezoning, and it appears that it's that extension of Kinley Street and the re-envisioning of that interchange a little bit will happen regardless of this rezoning. There has been TIAs to help justify some of those things, to decide some of the parameters of some of those things through previous site plans and potentially the subdivision now. I'm not actually, I may be able to look if there's another one under review, and perhaps the applicant can tell us. And there will be, if there hasn't been site plans through rezoning, through site plan or subdivision reviews of this area, because of those unique challenges. And that's when we do TIAs in downtown, is to understand things like queuing, driveways, where to put them, what sort of access restrictions might need to make sure that we operate the system safely. In terms of the rezoning case, just like every other case that's already in the DX district, we don't do TIAs at this time, because the rezoning doesn't, the change in entitlement is not really a significant driver of the outcomes as much as the site design itself is. And as a for instance, I'd kind of say that a 40-story building with absolutely no parking is going to drive almost no traffic to this site. A 10-story parking garage with no office space in it is going to drive a lot of traffic at this site. And it's really the parking that is a site plan specific thing that will drive the traffic impacts to an acute location. And so the evaluation of whether, if infrastructure is sufficient for this site is something that we kind of have to take on a case-by-case basis with a site plan to understand what is somebody trying to propose to put in and whether the site design can accommodate those movements or not. Does that address your concern or your question a little bit?
Kind of. Again, this is a pretty critical juncture. If this were to go through, are you all prepared to have that sophisticated level of discussion with your studies to date to be able to put in the parameters at site plan?
The infrastructure sufficiency section of the UDO is a factor in developing anywhere that's unique and constrained, regardless of what the zoning district is. And so while that might increase the physical limitation of what somebody could build within the height or the form side of the code, it doesn't change what infrastructure sufficiency would potentially limit them for. I don't know that there's a concern about infrastructure sufficiency here. I don't believe there is. There's actually a fair amount of capacity here, even though it is a critical sort of juncture. And it may be that changes in this area will slow down traffic a little bit, but it's not, slower does not necessarily mean less capacity. It just means people don't drive as fast. So yes, I guess the answer to your question, we're prepared to implement and enforce the infrastructure sufficiency section of the UDO in this case and all other cases.
Because I'm not, and yes, and the constraint during high volume periods, peak traffic times, absolutely. But even at 2 o'clock in the morning when you have people, teenagers, whatever, racing, that's also kind of a, that area I think is just, it's important to be thoughtful on all of those components in this particular area. Another thing that I think about, I just haven't seen in one of our rezonings like this kind of close to this kind of like a quasi cloverleaf, juncture, that sort of thing. The other thing I think about is like, is there going to be an issue if you have a 40-story building right there? Are you going to have an issue with glare? And, traffic impact from windows. And I don't know if that's something that's taken into consideration, but at this particular, I'm trying to think of, how, because you have a couple different angles that people are going to be coming in on this juncture to get to work, or at 2 o'clock in the morning, which there's no sun there, but, at various times, are there, would all that be taken into consideration at this location?
To my knowledge, I don't know that a traffic study or a transportation review of a site plan is ever considered, building cladding or things like that. So from a normal standpoint, that's an architectural design consideration that isn't something transportation engineers look at. So some of those concerns that you're having, no, we are not addressing normally. And I think that's the purview of this commission, maybe. I will add that changing or evolving this interchange to be less of an interchange and more of an extension of the downtown grid is adopted city policy through both the Western Boulevard Corridor Study and the Southern Gateway. And I'll describe in a slightly bigger picture what that will look like in its entirety. We talked about Kinley Street kind of turning this into a street grid. In the street plan, we also have an extension of West Street that will, and Dorothea Street, which will basically take out that interchange and add it as that loop and add it as another block of downtown, presumably adding to the RHA site that's there. And so this is a very similar outcome to what we've done in the north side of downtown around the Smoky Hollow Park and Smoky Hollow development with the changes to Capitol Boulevard and Peace Street with the square loop interchange. And we're planning on doing the same thing at whatever time that RHA does a large scale redevelopment there of their site, and are working with them to help their vision come to fruition along with a better street grid. So we decided or determined through some of that analysis of the Southern Gateway Corridor study that there really isn't an opportunity or a benefit to do anything in this quadrant with that movement. And extending some sort of street grid into the back of Washington Elementary and a cemetery and a creek also wasn't an opportunity. So we're a little bit limited in the ability to convert this entire area to a street grid, but the Kinley Street extension and the northwest quadrant changes are both parts of trying to change the context of this area and to change some of those driving behaviors that you reference, and to extend the downtown grid a little bit further south and to help connect between the north side of MLK and Western and the south side.
And you have you have the rights right now to continue to implement that plan if this rezoning were to go through. Like, you have all the
Yeah,
right.
there isn't anything about this rezoning case that directly
It's your
impacts
vision.
any of that. Yeah, there had been coordination between Raleigh Transportation, NCDOT, and the property owners involved here to get this abandonment that was referenced to happen. And now you can see that in the tax map that is now, that ramp is now on private property now. And implementation of the site plan will kind of implement all the changes that have been studied through this time. But that's not necessarily directly related to the zoning district. And I want to be clear about that.
So the extension of Kinley Street, would that be waived at any point? Like
It's
during
on the
site
street plan.
Okay.
It is a part of the adopted street plan. I suppose that there are potentially opportunities to find a variance from implementing the street plan, or somebody can always submit a comp plan amendment. I would maybe ask the city, Mr. York, to talk about what options somebody has if they wanted to defer or prevent construction that would normally be required by the new street section of the UDO when there's a street plan street. But as far as normal policy, we've got everything we need to implement that.
I don't know if we needed a response on that. Just based on the fact that it's part of the subdivision plat right now, I'm not concerned about Kinley somehow going away. That's under review right now. So it sounds like we're going to defer this item to ask for a series of additional considerations, such as the lack of frontage on Kinley and portions of MLK, an easement for the connection to the adjacent parcel, and then along the longer block faces where there is bike and ped infrastructure, some connection into the parcel to break up that frontage. If there are not any, one more comment, go ahead, Commissioner Bennett.
Thank you. Just a comment, not a question. It's kind of a standard comment. So I just am sorry that there was no consideration for affordable housing, especially given the demographics of the area. I know we can't require it. It just feels like going from 20 stories to 40 stories in an area with a large percentage of low-income residents. It would be nice if that were a consideration. Again, like I say, it would be nice. It feels like a lot of the rezonings that we see are not to serve the existing residents, but to serve who we want to come. And that's unfortunate to me.
Thank you for your comments. If there are no additional comments, let me get a nod from the applicant that deferring to the April 25th meeting gives you a sufficient amount of time.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Chair Fox, I just wanted to acknowledge that the agenda published last week did not have a lot of the supplemental materials you usually see with items. We shared that information with you last night, and that also has been added to the agenda this morning. It's available to the public as well as to the commission.
Thank you, Ms. Walter. We're going to move on to the next item on the agenda, which is item F.2, rezoning Z9122, the Illy Agnes Road assemblage. This is a request to rezone approximately 26.56 acres from a mix of residential districts to residential mixed-use 5 stories conditional use. We will start with a staff presentation by Sarah Shaughnessy.
Good morning, Planning Commission. Sarah Shaughnessy, Raleigh Planning and Development. This is a request to rezone 8 parcels, approximately 27 acres, just east of the Norfolk Southern Rail Line and on Illy Agnes Road. Your deadline for action is June 10th. Zoning in the area is predominantly residential. You see R10, R6, and some RX districts. The planned development to the south is predominantly residential too. That's Renaissance Park. And the parcel is just west of the TOD overlay that will come alongside the BRT, Southern BRT corridor. Here's an overview of the site, an aerial perspective. As you can see, a large portion of the site is occupied by the Raleigh Municipal Lake. There's also a utility easement that cuts through sort of the southern portion of the site. Again, the surrounding uses are predominantly residential, with commercial uses along Wilmington Boulevard, South Wilmington Street and South Saunders Street. There is an open space corridor designated in the future land use map along Carolina Pines, which is relevant to a condition to provide a greenway through the site connecting to that. And then the site is also adjacent to the Peach Road Park. So the plan or the proposal is to have a greenway connecting the Carolina Pines open space corridor through the site and to Peach Road Park. Some additional views of the site, Iliagnis Road, Carolina Pines, the Robinwood neighborhood, which is east of the site, and then the Renaissance Park neighborhood, which is south of the site. So a lot of open space and moderate scale residential. A summary of the proposed conditions. The conditions prohibit certain uses. They would limit the residential uses to 350 total units. Should the city request a bike share station, it would require the installation of a bike share station. The condition number 4 prohibits development on a portion of the site south of the utility easement and west of the stream that flows from the Raleigh Municipal Lake. So sort of prohibiting development on a portion of the site that isn't very accessible to begin with. And then this 5th condition requires the construction and dedication of a greenway trail. I've highlighted it in green because park staff did have some additional language that they requested as part of the condition, so something to consider. A snapshot of the change in entitlement. So again, the site is 26.5 acres. Based on our estimations, the proposed zoning would decrease the residential entitlement slightly, although it's comparable. You could see from the overview of the site, a large portion of the site is undevelopable because of the lake and the easement. So there are some built and environmental considerations there. And then per the RX standards, office and retail square feet would be limited according to the UDO. So the transportation and energy analysis, this is in a fairly walkable part of the city and is, will be located within half a mile from 2 future BRT stations. There is currently a lower transit score than average, though we expect that to change with the implementation of the Southern BRT. A lower bike score than average, although transportation costs are generally lower, and there is a very good job proximity in this census tract. Here is a map of the available bus service. So there's the South Saunders and then the Carolina Pines connector. And then again, it is within half a mile of 2 future BRT stations within a frequent transit area, but just outside of the TOD overlay currently. A snapshot of the affordability analysis subtracts marginally from the housing supply. There is no request for or no requirement for subsidized units, but it would permit a variety of housing types, some of which are not currently allowed. Smaller units would be allowed, smaller lots, and again, within walking distance of transit. Just a few bullet points about the demographics and land use history. There's a comparable percentage of people of color in this area compared to Raleigh as a whole. There is a higher percentage of low-income individuals and a higher percentage of residents with less than a high school education. The requested rezoning is consistent with the future land use map designation of medium-scale residential. It is inconsistent with the urban form map because the site is within a frequent transit area. The policy recommends an urban frontage. No frontage has currently been proposed as part of this case. But it is consistent with the comprehensive plan overall. And just several consistent policies. Healthy communities, connectivity, capitalizing on transit access, increasing bike and pedestrian activity. The inconsistent policy being the frontage piece in line with the urban design guidelines. We suggest revisions to condition number 5. Your deadline for action is June 10th.
Thank you, Ms. Shaughnessy. Next, we will hear from the applicant. The applicant and those in support have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
morning, everyone. Letitia Shapiro, Morningstar Law Group, 421 Fayetteville Street, here on behalf of the owner applicant, David Glebicki and George Perkins. I have with me here today Mac Paul of Morningstar Law Group, the applicant, David Glebicki, and Jonathan Bassey of Trademark Properties to assist in answering any questions you may have. This request is an opportunity to reposition an underutilized site to accommodate growth occurring in the Southern Gateway Corridor and provide housing and multimodal connectivity in an area that is well served by transit. Oops. Let's start that again. Excuse. Yep. Thanks. That's still doesn't want to go. Okay, it's not working.
Try using, I think if you just click through on the mouse, that should work.
Can we stop the clock for a moment?
This is one that just
Thank
has
you.
the line.
Okay.
I think it's the wrong slide, too.
Oh, that was just the first. Okay. We're having some technical difficulties. Can we have a moment just to pull up the applicant's presentation?
Absolutely, absolutely. We'll take a minute and allow the applicant and staff to work on the technical snafus with our laptop.
Oh, it's just presentation. Oh, no. Okay. I think that should be it. Thank you.
Victory, well done.
Welcome back.
All right, let's
Thank you.
restart the clock, and I'll give you a second to get yourself oriented before we go back in.
Thank you. I'll just go ahead and go to the next slide here. So as you heard, this site is made up of several lots with a combination of residential districts. This request would unify the zoning and allow some additional height, and the site is currently vacant. And I want to just kind of take you through if I may, a few photos to walk you through the property. The first picture on the left is an existing walking trail on the north side of the Raleigh Municipal Lake, and the lake occupies approximately 4 acres or 15% of the site. And as you can see from the photo on the right, the area has some issues, but it is a great opportunity for an improved amenity. And there's some nearby housing and another view of the lake. And this is an older apartment complex that is set back from the street and Peach Road Park across the street, which also has a cultural center, which is one of Raleigh's few cultural centers. And here's some additional pictures of the park. And as part of the development, as Sarah had mentioned, there is a greenway trail that will be constructed connecting the park to the site and the property to the north, keeping more eyes on the street and bringing in more users. And just some more additional photos of the park and the existing multi-use path here. And one more of the existing crossing into the multi-use path from the street, showing the interconnectivity to Renaissance Park, which is the residential development located just south of the site. And as mentioned, the site is comprised of a combination of residential districts, and the request would unify to RX5, providing flexibility in height. The value of the additional story would allow for a walk-up, affordable 4-story building. It is consistent with the future land use map, and overall, this site would allow for additional housing types and a denser development pattern in a frequent transit area, as reflected in the staff report. And this is a growing transit area that recommends an urban frontage, which brings me to some site-specific points related to issues cited in the staff report and concerns expressed during community engagement. This is a very early preliminary site plan that depicts the limited buildability of the area on a buildable area on the site due to environmental features and several easements. The urban form map does recommend an urban frontage, and no frontage is included in the request, which is a result of the constraints on the site and the opportunity to take advantage of the lake amenity, and having the buildings interact with the lake and not the street. And this is an area that's isolated and across from a park. So as you saw earlier, there are some other apartment complexes on the street that are set back from the street. And this next slide is a survey that just shows the constraints of the site with regard to, during our neighborhood meetings, neighbors who live in the Renaissance Park community, which is down here, they expressed a desire to keep this buffer area undisturbed over here. This area would be difficult to develop, and in the interest of being a good neighbor, there is a condition that no development would occur in the area south of the existing power line right away and the area west of the stream flowing into the municipal lake. And so here's that power line. Here's the buffer for that, for the stream. And so it's essentially this area right here that would remain undeveloped. And then there was also, during neighborhood meetings, we heard a desire to enhance the pedestrian connectivity. And as you heard from staff, they had asked for a greenway trail connection to Carolina Pines to the north up here, which the applicant has agreed to dedicate an easement to accommodate a greenway trail and conditions. And staff had also asked for a commitment regarding the alignment of the greenway. However, due to the constraints on the site, it is difficult to commit to exactly where that alignment can be placed at this time, or who will build the greenway, as it may be more advantageous for government to navigate that process rather than a private citizen given the constraints on the site. We will have a better idea about placement when we get to a full site plan. And we also heard some concerns about traffic regarding the Iliagnis Road connection. And we explained, as we understand, that the Iliagnis Road connection is not required as part of this zoning request, but we will do what the city requires us to do. for this project. We are building the multimodal path north and south, and it's not affecting the future Iliagnis Road connection. We remain cooperative and magnanimous on that issue. Overall, this is an attractive site for much-needed housing based on its location, and a win for the city, Renaissance Park, and transit. And we're here to answer any questions you might have.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to check in and see if there are any members of the public who wish to speak on this item. Seeing none, I'll open it up for questions and comments from commissioners. I'll start off with a question for staff. I had to read this a number of times. So on the surface, it appears like an upzoning, but then when you look at the number of units, it's actually a downzoning.
That is correct. I believe the applicant worked with transportation staff, and part of that was to avoid doing a TIA, the cap on residential development. I think the housing entitlement is pretty comparable to what you can build on the site. It does open up different building types.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Rains?
Just a question on the office and retail. The chart says it's 4,000 each. The condition says it's 30 and 40,000.
That, apologies, that is an update because it is residential mixed-use zoning. The UDO requires or has a limit on 4,000 total square feet for retail and office uses. So the presentation and the table is correct.
Thank you.
Any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Commissioner Bennett?
Question about the condition that's, will provide a bike share station if the city requests one. Why is that caveat there?
So, yeah, that is a slight change from language that you've heard previously. We worked with transportation staff, and they advised that language. I think there is some uncertainty about their bike share client, and they just wanted to leave some flexibility depending on what the bike share plan looks like in the future.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to follow up on that, if I may. Does the precise wording of the condition require a bike station to be part of the Raleigh bike station, or would it be possible for a developer to install a private standalone bike share station like I've seen in some developments?
We will do whatever the city requests. It is inconsequential to us.
Okay, thank you. I was just curious more about the wording and the way these conditions work than any kind of impediment on this case.
Maintain city consistency is fine with us.
So to make sure I understand, was that a suggestion for changing to that wording?
No, I was just curious about the wording and what that would require down the road. As far as this case is concerned, I don't see a problem either way.
Okay. And Commissioner Bennett, and then Commissioner Lampman.
Thank you. I did want to thank the applicant for the thoroughness of the neighborhood meeting summaries. It was very helpful. It provided the questions and the comments and the responses. So it's always really helpful when we can see the a summary of the back and forth. And so I really appreciated that. Thank you.
And Commissioner Lampman?
This might not be an educated question, but I need to be educated, I think. So the fact that this is a bunch of parcels being kind of rezoned together, how does that impact setbacks on each parcel individually? I would assume they just go in as a package, and like, is it just the full, like, how does that work? I feel like it's a really dumb question.
Yeah, that's correct, because it's being rezoned as a package. Any development standards would apply uniformly across all of the parcels together.
Individual parcels have, like, it's like the big global.
Yes, that's correct.
Parcel. Okay. And I'm sorry, just to ask, so with the current limitations on that they're offering, so 350 units, and then we saw the site plan, and clearly there's a lot of constraints on this site as well. What would be a foreseeable, if because I mean, I think that the rezoning would allow for anything. The site itself has natural constraints, but, is there any, because we've seen a site plan, but that site plan is not part of the conditions, correct? So is there any concern that, that they might have the opportunity to build something other than what we have been visually prepared for here?
I think, so one of the conditions does limit development on a portion of the site and constrain development to the portion of the site that you saw included with the site plan. I think you are right, like there is some flexibility. They're not required to submit a site plan as part of the rezoning process. So the rezoning is the total envelope of what is possible on the site. But I think, based on the conditions they've submitted and the site plan, I think it's very likely, and the constraints on the site, the environmental constraints and the utility easement, that you'll see something similar to the site plan that they've presented.
So I think part of my concern is, so what if one of the parcels was sold? Like, how would that impact the ability to develop those parcels that are sold? Let's say, I just am wanting to know, I say yes, what's the impact if, let's say, that northernmost, the largest parcel of them all, was to be sold separately, would they still be not allowed to develop west of the stream?
I think the zoning conditions that you would recommend to approve, the zoning conditions, if council approves them, would apply to all parcels. So if the parcel were sold and they wanted to develop it, they would need to rezone to change those conditions.
Okay, thank you.
If these are adopted.
Okay. I have another question for staff. I just wanted a little bit of clarification. There's a revision requirement required for condition number 5. Is that a technical correction that can happen, or they would need to come back regardless? Okay. They would need to come back, not considered just a technical revision. So it sounds like the applicant would need to come back to our April 25th meeting regardless to address that condition number 5. I believe there was also a note about additional information required on the Greenway Trail exhibit. Is that correct?
I think there's some question whether it's technical or not. And if my understanding, the only change was to insert language that the city staff would review ultimately the Greenway plan, which I believe is technical. So I don't know if we can hold it while I don't want to hold up your meeting, but rather than coming back in 2 weeks just to make that change, if it's not necessary, we certainly would like to treat it as technical. But if it's not technical, obviously we would come back.
Are you planning to add an exhibit?
We were not, just because of the concern about all the constraints and not knowing exactly where the alignment. So that's why we didn't do the exhibit. We just described that it has to be done, and these are the points. It has to connect to Ely Agnes, and it has to connect to Carolina Pines.
Can we move on to another item and come back to this one?
Agenda item or just continue questions? Sure. Commissioner Bennett has one more question, and then Commissioner O'Haver.
I think this is for staff. There was a statement in the staff report on page 12, and it says additional affordable units could be included under the frequent transit development option. Due to environmental and built constraints, it is possible but unlikely that the portion of the site on which development is prohibited by said proposed condition would be developed under the existing zoning. I just got confused reading that.
Sure,
Can you
yeah.
explain?
So just to, if you remember the site overview, there are environmental and built constraints on the site. They have offered a condition that prohibits development on a portion of the site. The staff report was saying that development on the portion of the site that the condition prohibits is unlikely due to the environmental constraints on the site. And then to your question about affordable housing, as part of the UDO, there is a frequent transit development option that allows for additional height in exchange for a certain percentage of the units if they are made affordable at 60% of the area median income. So, and they could achieve that without rezoning. That would be part of the site plan process.
Commissioner O'Haver.
So a couple questions about Raleigh Municipal Lakes, probably for staff. It doesn't seem like there's any FEMA or firm requirements along there, any additional stormwater protection. So my question is there any concern about the quality of that lake? And then secondly, it looks like there's some folks that like to fish out there and pull out some pretty nice fish. So I'm confused. Is that part of private property? Is it public?
I don't see stormwater staff here.
I've asked her to come over.
Okay.
Private properties, there's a sewer easement to the north that people walk on. John the Bassey, Trademark Properties, part of the applicant. There's a sewer easement to the north of the property that people walk on to fish. They go through two private properties in order to do so. The lake is private, the property is private. It is subject to and jurisdictions of the U.S. Army Corps and NC DENR, subject to 50-foot buffer around the lake. You could see that 50-foot buffer in the Alta survey. That buffer is part of what will be submitted during site plan and protected and can't be touched.
Okay, I didn't see the 50-foot buffer. It looked like the site plan had a unit, right? Was it outside of that 50-foot buffer?
If you can see this, if you look at the dotted line right here,
Yeah.
So that dotted line from here inward is the 50-foot buffer. That was that.
Okay. Well, regardless of what the site plan shows, if the buffer's there, then that can be built on.
Right. Absolutely. If there are no more questions on this item, we're going to hold it and come back to it later in the agenda because there are a couple of questions that staff is finding an answer to right now. So we're going to move on to item F, or that is item F.3, rezoning Z9322, South Wilmington Street assemblage north of Iliagnis Road. This is a request to rezone approximately 8.24 acres from commercial mixed-use 3 stories transit overlay district to commercial mixed-use 20 stories urban limited frontage conditional use transit overlay district. We will start with a staff presentation by Sarah Shaughnessy.
Hello again. Let me just pull up the. All right, good morning. This is Z9322, a request to rezone approximately 8 acres on South Wilmington Street, Renfro, and Iliagnis Road. The applicant has added a parcel that was not included when notice was mailed out for this case. So your deadline for action is June 10th. We are recommending a deferral to April 25th, 2023, to allow staff time to properly notice the case. The mailing radius does affect one additional parcel, and we want to be transparent in the policy. But with your permission, staff would like to still give the presentation today. I know the applicant is here and prepared to present as well. Okay. So the zoning in the area is predominantly commercial mixed use and industrial mixed use along South Wilmington Street with some residential neighborhoods between the corridors. It is also part of the transit overlay district. An aerial view of the site, again, moderate scale residential in the neighborhoods surrounding the corridors with industrial and commercial uses between and along South Saunders and Wilmington Street. Some additional views of the site. So this is Wilmington Street looking north, and then Renfro Road behind the site, looking out at the site. And then some additional views. A summary of the proposed conditions. Conditions prohibit detention centers, jails, and prisons. They would limit the total number of residential units to 1,000 units, limit office uses and retail uses to specific square footage, and then also a condition that requires post-development stormwater discharge not to exceed the pre-development peak flow rates for up to 100-year storm events. An overview of the change in entitlement. So again, about 8 acres would increase the residential entitlement, would decrease office and retail entitlement. Regarding the transportation and energy analysis, a pretty comparable walk score to the citywide average, a higher transit score than average, and again, this is accessible by existing transit and then also on the part of a BRT station area. There's a lower bike score than average, but again, as with the previous case, transportation costs and job proximity are both very good in the census tract. Here's a map of current bus service. This is in the same area as the case you just heard, so same service. The case does not include subsidized units specifically, but it would add to the housing supply and permit a variety of unit types and sizes. A few bullet points about demographics and land use history. This is the same census tract as the case you just heard, so there are a higher percentage of people of color in this tract, a higher percentage of low-income individuals, and a higher percentage of individuals with less than a high school education. The requested commercial mixed-use zoning is consistent with the community mixed-use designation. The proposed urban limited frontage is consistent with the urban form map. And the case is consistent with the comprehensive plan overall. A number of consistent policies here. There were no inconsistent policies. And again, we would like we are requesting deferral to April 25th to give staff time to appropriately notice this case with the inclusion of the additional parcel. And that concludes my presentation. I know the applicant is also here.
Okay. We will shift over to the applicant team. The applicant and those in support have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Good morning, Jamie Schwadler with Parker Poe, Adams and Bernstein here on behalf of the applicant. And before the time starts, I don't know if we should not open the public hearing and just have a discussion and leave the public hearing for after the case has been renoticed with the full, okay. So I'll be respectful of time and be well under 10 minutes, but just wanted to make sure we were all on the same page there. Thank you, Sarah. I'm here on behalf of the applicant this morning. The development team is also with me, which includes Gabe Gilwa with Atlas Stark, David Meeker with Carpenter Development, my colleague Mark Frederick, and Tyler O'Farrell with Kimley Horn. The vision for this project is to restore this parcel as part of the southern gateway into the grandeur that it was when this area was developed by adding a mix of uses and opportunity that became very car-dominated and strip-centered oriented after some time. So the site is just 2 miles south of downtown. It consists of 17 parcels now. That's the staff report says 16 and about 8.5 acres. We'll add another parcel for a total of 17, about 10 acres, and you'll see that when this case comes back on the 25th. It's on the west side of Wilmington Street between Parkland to the north and Iliagnis to the south, highlighted in yellow there. In the last 5 years, this area has seen a tremendous amount of change in terms of city plans to position it for redevelopment. 2 key policies have guided most of those changes. One, placing density and people close to infrastructure or planned expansions of infrastructure on a centralized route. And then 2, increasing the modes of transportation along those centralized routes. It's no surprise then that the city policies are consistent with our request and it's supported in terms of use, height, and intensity requested here. That policy starts with a future land map, land use map shown on the right, which designates the site for community mixed use. This envisions larger pedestrian-oriented districts and support for additional building height near transit stations. It's also within the Southern Gateway Small Area Plan guidance that was passed in 2017 in the South Wilmington Rush Street focus area. This envisions a vibrant core linking several currently isolated communities, which are currently separated by major thoroughfares. And in fact, that 2017 report noted that a number of neighborhoods exist within the corridor. However, the urban fabric has been eroded, and by a lack of investment and overwhelming focus on the transportation needs of commuters and visitors passing the site and going to downtown Raleigh from outlying areas. The focus of this plan is to generate strategies for connectivity, infrastructure, and investment to support growth and reinvestment in this area. And that's what we aim to do here. The more recent guidance is in the urban format, which designates this area not only within the frequent transit area, the bus rapid transit area, but also within a transit station area. So the bus rapid transit corridor is there in purple, the transit station area is there in the circle, and both of those policies, again, encourage increased height and development close to the bus rapid transit line. The urban format designation also recommends an urban frontage, and Table LU2 supports building heights of up to 20 stories for emerging urban centers within areas designated for community mixed use, such as this site. So last year, the project was also included in the city's transit overlay district zoning, which is shown on the screen to your right. That green hatched area shows where the TOD overlay occurs and makes this site not only within that zoning, but directly adjacent to the TOD, to the BRT corridor. And thus a change from CX3 to a CX20 urban limited with conditional use with that TOD overlay is directly consistent with all of the guidance policies I just listed. CX is the primary corresponding district for the community mixed use designation on the flume. And as the staff reports notes, this is consistent with the 20-story designation and supporting policies in the comprehensive plan. We've also offered an urban limited frontage, which is consistent with the urban form maps call, and included several conditions here on the screen that prohibit incompatible uses. And then the next three provide more of a box for a program that's consistent with what neighbors expressed for more certainty in the community meeting. So the generation from CX3 to 20 with the TOD generates a significant amount of development potential. We tried to scale that back to be a little bit more congruent with the existing single-family neighborhood, but still provide that increased density along the major transportation line. And then based on staff and community feedback, we also committed to treating up to the 100-year storm due to drainage issues within the area and provided that to staff. Just highlight briefly, this was covered earlier, the project location is on the BRT transit line, so 2 miles south of the downtown to where you'd be able to connect in the hub and get commuters in and around the triangle with ease. So exactly, our site is exactly where you'd want to put that increased density. That is a 10% design at this point, as we understand. So the cross-section is not yet set, but what we know is that we've been able to commit the urban limited frontage, and all the details of that are on the top left of your screen. The existing cross-section is on the right. So today it only has two avenues divided by a median with sidewalks on each side. The current proposed BRT cross-section, which is still subject to change, shows that median kind of opened up for the BRT in the center, and then additional bike facilities and, of course, sidewalk facilities on both sides of the street. So all of that will be worked out at site plan, and we will, of course, follow the design that the city settles on for that BRT cross-section, but it is still in the works, and so that would apply to our site and enable the two sites to talk to each other, essentially, during site plan review. Because of those policies, we are consistent with a number of policies in the comprehensive plan and consistent with the future land use map, and are really excited today to be here to you without any outstanding issues and able to deliver what we hope will be one of the first projects within the TOD corridor corridor, providing that reinvestment that was envisioned in the 2017 report. We appreciate the time to be able to present today. I will not be able to be here on the 25th, and nor will David, so we'd really appreciate any feedback today to enable us to make any changes that the commission might see fit before we come back, hopefully for action on the 25th. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. I did just want to check in to make sure there were no members of the public who had come wishing to speak on this item today. Okay, seeing none. Going to move on to some questions and comments from commissioners, and I'll just acknowledge we will take public comment at the next meeting when this comes back. Any questions or comments? Commissioner Lampman.
I just have more of a curiosity question. When you do the next neighborhood meeting, would you include like a link to this meeting, or that we had this as part of the information package?
So we're not requesting an additional neighborhood meeting. We're just requesting noticing for this meeting, with the notice including the additional parcel.
So it wouldn't require another meeting. It would just require the notice.
Correct. Okay. Yeah, and then another planning commission meeting.
Excellent. Commissioner O'Haver.
I think it's a great project. I'm excited. I guess I will, not sure if Ms. Bennett was going to make this comment, but since it is in TOD, and we are looking at providing quite a bit additional density, even though it's in the comp plan, it would be great to see some affordable housing. So just need to make the comment.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Haver. You knew it was coming. But I did have other questions. The presentation does list inconsistent policies, but the staff report says there are none. I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, so the presentation included in your backup, there is an error on the slide. It should read consistent policies. It's a continuance of the list of policies,
Okay.
So there are no inconsistent policies. All the ones listed in the presentation are consistent.
Okay, thank you for that. And let me see, what else? So just to piggyback on Commissioner O'Haver's comment, I don't really have an issue with this rezoning either. I like that there is all this interest now in investing in an area that has been disinvested in for so long. I'm just nervous that the investment that's coming is not going to benefit the people who are there. I am concerned specifically with this one about the downstream flooding. I know there is that condition, but I just wonder if it's enough. This is pretty close to Rochester Heights, and we know there has been documented flooding there. And I'm just wondering if we shouldn't be looking at maybe some above and beyond conditions for stormwater to ensure that what we're doing here doesn't affect that area any more than it's already affected. And it would be nice if the first project delivered in this TOD area did include affordable housing.
Thank you for that. I'm going to put the question to stormwater staff if there are any additional recommendations or ideas for adding additional conditions to this case to deal with stormwater.
Thank you. Sally Hoyt, Stormwater Department. So the condition that's being offered, as Commissioner Bennett said, is essentially not above and beyond because it addresses downstream structural flooding. So it would likely be required anyway under the UDO. In terms of, but it is very, so there's a couple things. I have not looked to see if there is downstream structural flooding on both of the tributaries that come out from the site. So this could be more protective, and perhaps the applicant could address that. So this could be more protective of the other tributary if it's not on both of them. This is pretty protective in terms of addressing so many different design storms from a runoff rate control. Of course, that doesn't address the volume of runoff. So one way that I believe, Commissioner Fox, your question was how could they go beyond? So a condition that addressed the volume of runoff could go beyond that. And that would be something like a green stormwater infrastructure condition, something that required either infiltration or rainwater reuse, that sort of thing.
So low impact development techniques.
Yes.
Okay. Excellent, thank you. Question for the applicant. Has the applicant considered additional conditions related to low impact development, green stormwater infrastructure?
When we had the conversation about stormwater, the 100-year, as you all know, the UDO treats to the 2 and the 10. The staff asked us to consider committing to the 100 deal to do with the flooding, and no other discussions were suggested about that. So we're happy to visit those. It's just not something that we thought the 100-year was kind of addressing that issue, but we're happy to look into that.
Excellent. I'd be interested in looking at quantity versus just quality on this one. Commissioner Haber.
And this is, I think we've talked about this before. I think this is one of those situations with stormwater where you're required to detain what's existing, and a lot of this is paved. So there's a lot coming off now. So that's where the issues with the volume versus the quality, correct?
Commissioner Bennett.
Question for staff, and it's not specific to this rezoning, but given all of the rezonings that we're seeing in this area, is there any type of cumulative study going on that's going to look at how all of this is going to affect the area that is currently being flooded?
That's a good question. I do not recall if this is in the Rocky Branch watershed. That would potentially be in the stormwater table. If it's in the Rocky Branch, we are starting in a matter of weeks a watershed plan for that vicinity, for Rocky Branch and for some previously unstudied portions of the Walnut Creek watershed. Over time, we're studying every watershed in the city, but we have prioritized those studies based on where there's known issues. Okay, I will have to find out if it's not in Rocky, so I'll have to find out if it's in the part of Walnut we're studying starting this year.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question for staff. I believe I have my thinking correct on this, but I just want to double check. So it's in the Transit Overlay District, which would allow an additional 50% height increase when a bunch of conditions are met according to residential uses and affordable housing, and that would apply here, but the conditions would take precedent over any allowance under the TOD, so it'd still be the unit count would hold control here, but without that, but the applicants could still go to 30 stories with the TOD if they met all their conditions for additional height. Okay, thank you.
If there are no additional questions, we know we have to defer this item to allow additional notice and then to take public comment. It does sound like we may need a little bit of investigation on staff's behalf there to find out when this watershed is being studied. And then we are going to look at some additional conditions regarding water quantity versus just quality. Okay. Without objection, we're deferring this item to our April 25th meeting. Is staff ready to roll back to the previous agenda item? Okay. Okay. So going back to item F.2, that's Z9122, Iliagnis Road assemblage. we had a question on whether or not the changes required to condition number 5 would be considered a technical revision. The answer we're hearing is yes, that would be a technical revision. Technical revisions can happen after Planning Commission review. Are there any additional questions or comments for either the staff or applicant?
So we decided that it is a technical review and can happen after we make a.
Correct. Correct. So that means we could make a recommendation for approval or denial at this time, and then that technical revision can happen after, between now and the city council meeting.
I'll make a motion.
Okay.
I
Thank
move
you.
to recommend adoption of the proposed consistency statement dated April 11, 2023, contained in the agenda materials. Where did it go? And to recommend approval of the zoning amendment case Z 9122.
Excellent. Do we have a second?
A second.
Okay. Commissioner O'Haver has offered a recommendation for approval of Z9122. Commissioner Rains has offered a second. Is there any additional discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Seeing none, by show of hands, those in favor and any opposed? That motion passes unanimously. Now we will move on to item F.4. This is rezoning Z123 northwest of the intersection of Rock Quarry Road and Barwell Road. This is a request to rezone approximately 2.5 acres from residential 4 to neighborhood mixed use 3 stories parking limited conditional use. We will start with a staff presentation by Alicia Thomas.
Good morning, Alicia Thomas. Excuse me. Good morning, Alicia Thomas, Planning and Development. This request is for Z123 for 5509 Rock Quarry Road. The request is to rezone 2.5 acres from R4 to neighborhood mixed use 3 parking limited conditional use. Your deadline for action is June 10th. So the site currently is predominantly residential with R4 and R10 zoning pretty much taking up the majority of the area. To the north and south are low-scale residential, as well as moderate-scale residential to the south. There is a small portion of neighborhood mixed use on the opposite side of the site along Rock Quarry Road, as well as there is Barwell Community Park and Elementary School to the east of the site. Zooming in on the site, as you can see, it is at the northwest corner of the intersection of Rock Quarry Road and Barwell Road. The site is currently vacant. It is wooded here on the site. Here are the sign conditions. Your staff report that you received last week had this as an outstanding issue. However, staff has received a signed version of the condition, and so here is the language for the condition pertaining to the cross-access agreement. The existing versus proposed zoning, again, the zoning is changing from R4 to NX3 PLCU. The acreage will remain the same. The number of units will pretty much increase by about 3.5 times the amount. Office and retail are currently not allowed in the R4 district. However, under the proposed zoning, the amount of office and retail space will increase drastically. Transportation and energy analysis. This site has a higher walk score than average. However, it has lower transit, bike, transportation costs, and job proximity average compared to the city. The site has 2 transit stops nearby. There's Route 17 and Route 18, which are both less than 1/4 of a mile, and they offer 60-minute service. The site would, or the proposed rezoning would add additional housing supply. It would not include subsidized housing. It would permit a variety of housing types, including smaller units being allowed, smaller lots than citywide average, and again, the site is within walking distance of transit locations. Area residents who are generally low income and people of color make up a large portion of the population in this area compared to the city average. And the housing costs have increased, however, they are still lower than the city average. The request is inconsistent with the moderate scale residential land use designation. The parking limited frontage is consistent with the urban form map, as this site is along has a transit emphasis corridor. The request is consistent with the comprehensive plan overall. And here are a list of policies that the case is consistent with, including compact development, zoning and infrastructure, density transitions, scale and design of new commercial uses, and housing variety. Here are a list of some of the inconsistent policies. I'm going to highlight some of the key policies as the future land use map and zoning consistency, pedestrian-friendly development, encouraging nodal development and retail nodes. Again, there was an outstanding issue listed in the staff report. However, staff has received the signed copy, so therefore Planning Commission can review the case today. Your deadline for action is June 10th.
Thank you, Ms. Thomas. Next, we'll hear from the applicant. The applicant and those in support have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Good morning, Commissioners. Molly Stewart, Morningstar Law Group, here on behalf of the applicant Farahi LLC. I'd like to begin by talking about Rock Quarry Road. So Rock Quarry Road, as you can see on your screen, is serving a lot of new residential development in the area and becoming a heavily used arterial. Currently in this location, the street is quite narrow and it varies in width along its length. The street plan for Rock Quarry Road calls for the avenue 4-lane divided, which has a 109-foot right-of-way width with 2 lanes in each direction instead of the current single lane in each direction at this location. So in that context, we start to see that Rock Quarry Road, to the extent that it has some residential character left today, is not anticipated to retain its low-density residential character in the future, as it serves the surrounding development as more of a transportation thoroughfare. However, the area is currently zoned for relatively low density residential use, primarily single-family attached and detached houses. And in addition to the long-term plans to widen Rock Quarry Road, the city has also designated this area as a transit emphasis corridor, so capable of serving some higher densities here right along that major roadway frontage. So in summary, the development of the subject property under the existing zoning is simply impossible today, since Rock Quarry Road is planned to serve uses other than single-family lots and becomes very difficult to use for this purpose. So what is appropriate here? So we propose a zoning classification which is designed to serve the exploding residential development surrounding this site. The site is very close to an existing neighborhood commercial use area, and with the increasing traffic on Rock Quarry Road, this site could provide an opportunity to access services from the opposite direction of travel. That doesn't exist in this area today. So the idea that Rock Quarry Road is in a transitional state right now is reflected in some of the back and forth that we've had with staff regarding cross-access at this location. So on this slide is the basic rule from the UDO, which requires cross-access to adjacent parcels along the same frontage, along major roadways such as Rock Quarry Road. However, there is an exception in the UDO, and this makes a lot of sense. The UDO supports what's really an intuitive idea that we wouldn't require cross-access between single-family residential properties to connect those via driveway. I think that makes sense to everybody. But we did receive a staff comment to our rezoning request, which urged cross-access here anyway. Our neighbors are single-family residential, and yet we received this comment. This is consistent with the idea of a change happening in Rock Quarry Road. In other words, the development patterns associated with the uses for which this property is currently zoned are simply incompatible with the level of traffic and the future plans for Rock Quarry Road.
If you'd like to just finish your presentation, we'll.
Sure, thank you. So these are the policies cited by staff in making the request for cross-access. These reference the roadway's functional characteristics, the surrounding land uses, the need for improved roadway capacity in that need for cross-access. So in response, the applicant has included this requirement, and the only exception you see in this condition is if for some reason one of those adjacent properties were to redevelop as single-family housing. In that case, we wouldn't be required to provide cross-access to that new use. So finally, I'll just note that to the extent the surrounding residential zoning does continue to apply for some period of time, the neighborhood transitions will apply in this location along this mixed-use boundary to provide protection in the interim period. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sturt. Just want to make sure there are no members of the public who wish to speak on this item. Seeing none, I'll open it up for questions and comments from commissioners. Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you. So first, I just want to note, I guess in my estimation, when I see this, when I compare the consistent policies with the inconsistent policies and the key inconsistent policies, I would have deemed this inconsistent. I know that's a judgment call, but it seemed like some of the inconsistent policies were pretty significant, dealing with the pedestrian-friendly development and nodal development and the intensity of commercial use. And there was, I had it up. In the staff report, it noted that the request does not provide conditions to address height, mass, and scale of the development. Therefore, a condition that demonstrates respect to the surrounding residential area may aid in providing consistency with this policy. That's significant for me. Very significant. It's enough to make me not support the rezoning request, because I think it has to be respectful of the development that's there, regardless of whether or not it's changing. It's there now, and I think there needs to be some consideration of what's there.
Do you have any thoughts on what that looks like with the 3-story requirement, reducing it, or just providing additional setbacks or buffers?
Not really. I mean, I'll defer to staff of what that would look like.
And while staff's coming up, also noting the inconsistency with pedestrian-friendly development. Since this is a one parcel rezoning, any recommendations by which to make us more consistent with that particular policy?
Gotcha. Yes, so in the staff report, there is mention of like adding certain conditions related to building mass and scale of development. I agree that adding that as a condition could help in making it more consistent, as well as I think there was another policy about adding, conditions related to the type of activity that could occur, like limiting uses, drive-throughs, and lighting, as this would allow for various commercial uses. I think that was in relationship to policy LU 7.1 and 10.6 retail nodes. Those were conditions that, or recommendations that staff had added as it related to those policies.
Excellent. And I'm not recalling, I apologize. Are drive-throughs allowed in NX
Yes, ma'am.
They are? Okay. So perhaps a condition speaking to that might make it more consistent.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. If the applicant would like to come up, if you want to respond to Commissioner Bennett's comments or any of the discussion.
Yes, thank you. As far as height and mass, we did request the three-story zoning here in large part to keep it as compatible as possible while still addressing the change in Rock Quarry Road. So serving as that transition as the NX district is intended to do at the minimum height that can be requested. I'll note that our districts are also limited to 3 stories in height, as are our X districts. So it's, I mean, there are some specialty conditions, NCODs, things like that, but in general, you don't see heights lower than that here. And as far as addressing the transition to the surrounding neighborhoods, as I noted, the neighborhood transitions do apply here. So we have not only a buffer as far as where the building can be, but then additional height control beyond that as well. And designed to address exactly that concern here. I'm not aware of any reason that this site would be different or special from the situation that those provisions were designed to address. With respect to lighting concerns, I would note that at the boundary between a mixed-use district and an R district, the UDO doesn't allow any more than 1/2 foot candle of lighting to cross that property line. It is difficult or impossible to reduce it beyond that. And it has other restrictions about the shielding of fixtures in parking areas up against that area. And so there are just a lot of protections already built into the UDO at the boundary of an R district.
Can you remind us what the width of that buffer is between the mixed-use district and the residential?
The neighborhood transition? Yes. So the total width of the controls that exist is 100 feet. It's the first 50 feet that has no building permitted in it, and it varies as far as how that gets allocated between landscaping and paved areas. But then the next 50 feet has the height control, and staff can correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that starts at 45 feet at that 50-foot line and rises at a 45-degree angle from there.
Are there any additional questions or comments for either staff or the applicant?
I am also concerned about the pedestrian-friendly environment noted in the inconsistencies. I think a prohibition against pedestrian unfriendly uses would go a long way towards helping that. Drive-throughs, for instance.
If there are no additional comments, it sounds like we're going to defer this item to allow the applicant time to consider conditions related to use.
Certainly. I guess I just would ask for clarity as far as any particular uses that are of concern here on this. You know, this is sort of an arterial where people are making those quick stops. I just want to understand what we're looking for here.
Go ahead, Commissioner Otwell.
Drive-throughs, like commercial drive-throughs, were my primary concern.
Gotcha.
Any additional comment? Commissioner O'Haver, you look expectant.
You know me too well. I mean, are we just, excuse me, are we just asking that the applicant come back with no drive-throughs, or are we asking that there are some additional considerations for what it means to be consistent with pedestrian-friendly environment? I just want to be clear on that.
I think it might be a little bit of
I don't want the applicant
both.
to come back and just have that one condition with drive-throughs
Yeah.
and still have issues when they come back. So I just want to make sure we're clear on what we're asking here.
The one thing that I'm clear on is that I think that drive-throughs would be detrimental to the school and the park and the Barwell Road pedestrian improvements that are currently in planning. I can't conceive of what else would really improve pedestrian access in and around an isolated site like this along a road. If there's something that somebody would suggest or that staff could recommend, I can't think of anything that I would recommend.
You know, I'm not disagreeing with the request. I just want to make sure we're clear for the applicant since you get one shot at it.
Yeah, from my perspective, given the cross-section that's proposed, I believe that adequately adds pedestrian infrastructure and also bike infrastructure. My concern was also about drive-throughs and that being a detrimental use in that particular area. Okay. If there's no additional comment, we're going to defer you to the April 25th meeting, assuming that gives an appropriate amount of time. Okay.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And moving on to item F.5, this is rezoning Z223, northeast of the intersection of Litchford Road and Old Wake Forest Road. This is a request to rezone approximately 9.26 acres from residential 6 and industrial mixed use 3 to residential mixed use 5 conditional use. We will start with a staff presentation by Alicia Thomas.
All right, good morning. Z223 is a request to rezone 9.26 acres from residential 6 and industrial mixed use 3 to residential mixed use 5. Your deadline for action is June 10th. The zoning in this area is a mix of residential and industrial uses with R10 and R6 to the west of Litchford Road and industrial mixed use to the east. The site has moderate and low scale residential to the north and west of the site. Moderate scale to the north and high scale to the south. Both of these have apartments, building types on these lots, whereas to the west of the site is low scale residential, which consists mostly of detached single family homes, whereas to the far east is regional mixed use, which most of these properties have general building types with industrial uses. Here is a close view of the site. The site has frontage along Litchford Road, as well as a small portion of the site has frontage along Round Rock Drive. The site also has, it abuts along the railroad track, CSX Railroad. Here is a view of the site along Litchford Road. It's currently vacant and wooded. And here is another shot along Round Rock Drive. Here are a summary of the proposed conditions. There's 2 conditions. The first one will limit various uses on the site, as well as condition number 2 will put a cap on the number of residential density with a max of 160 dwelling units. So the number of units, the maximum number of units in this request would basically double from 80 to 160. The office and retail square footage is currently a large amount of square footage that is allowed under the existing zoning. However, with the proposed rezoning, the amount of square footage would cut drastically with a maximum of 4,000 square feet for both office and retail. The site has a lower walk score than average. It has the same transit score as the city's average, a lower bike score, and a lower transportation cost index average, while it has a higher job proximity average. The site is about a quarter of a mile north of a transit stop, which is for Route 25L, which has 60-minute service. The request would add housing supply. It does not include subsidized units. However, it would permit a variety of housing types, allow smaller units, smaller lots than the city average, and again, it is within walking distance of transit. The site has more residents of color than the citywide average, and the housing costs have increased, but they are lower than the city's citywide average. The requested RX5 rezoning request is inconsistent with the moderate scale future land use designation. The site has no urban form guidance. There is no designation here. The request overall is consistent with the comp plan. Here are a list of consistent policies. I'll highlight the key policies of compact development, housing variety, infill development, and zoning for housing. And here are a few of the inconsistent policies. Again, the future land use map being one of the policies, reinforcing the urban pattern and buffering requirements. There are no outstanding issues, and your deadline for action is June 10th.
Thank you, Ms. Thomas. Next, we will hear from the applicant. The applicant and those in support have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Good morning, members of Planning Commission, Worth Mills, Longleaf Law Partners here on behalf of KDM Development Corp., the rezoning applicant. This is a rezoning to facilitate multifamily development of an underutilized piece of property along Litchford Road. It is currently zoned a mix of RX and IX3, which is a little uncommon to have those two zoning districts line up next to one another. We're proposing to rezone to RX5, conditional use, prohibiting the dormitory fraternity sorority use and limiting development to 160 units. Future land use map also has a split designation of moderate scale residential and regional mixed use. We think the proposed rezoning incorporates some of each of those future land use map designations, but is more consistent with the moderate scale density designation. So the property is just over 9 acres, located on the eastern side of Litchford Road. The CSX line borders our eastern boundary. There are 2 points of Round Rock Drive, right here and right here, that both stub into this property. Any development on this site is going to be required to connect those 2 stubs, which will increase both pedestrian and vehicular connectivity in this area. As mentioned, the adjacent uses include a church and apartments to the north and south, as well as these properties to the north along Round Rock Drive, which are vacant and zoned for industrial mixed use. I wanted to show the topographic map as well. This property sort of sits in a bowl shape, both from Litchford Road and from the CSX line. You could sort of see it in Alicia's photo on that Round Rock Drive facing property. So the single family homes across Litchford Road sit about 20 feet higher, not 200, that'd be pretty big. Sit about 20 feet higher than the closest developable area on this site. I'll also note that there is a stream that you can see on the map. There's also a stream that runs right here, so that it kind of forks right in the middle of our site there. While there are a couple of streams and some identified wetlands on our site, this property is not within the city's floodplain map, nor are any of the properties that flow into the stream that ultimately leads to Gresham Lake, as you see to the north above. So the site, as mentioned, is split zoned. On the western side is R6, on the eastern side is IX3. The industrial uses that you see along Round Rock Drive include an auto center, HVAC, fabrication, store, and a concrete contractor. So you've got these incompatible uses pretty close to what is a predominantly residential character along Litchford Road. And you can see that that intensity shifts to a higher intensity of residential as you move from the west side to the east side of Litchford Road. And this property is sort of that land use transition from existing industrial uses towards the low-scale residential that you see on the western side of the property. And the future land use map is consistent with that split zoning as well. As mentioned, over half the property is designated as moderate scale residential, while the eastern boundary is designated for regional mixed use. I wanted to include the street plan here as well. for two reasons. One, the Litchford Road right-of-way here is mapped for an avenue 4-lane divided, so that's a 109-foot wide right-of-way. And to the northeast, you can see that purple dotted line, and that is the plan to connect Sinrow Boulevard with Ruritania Street, which is going to increase the connectivity between the land between Capitol Boulevard and the CXX line with the Millbrook area. Currently, there's only one connection point, and it's about a half a mile south. And so you see the future land use map contemplate a transition from the industrial uses that are to the north and to the east today towards a more commercial-focused, neighborhood-serving-focused future land use map designation, not only with regional mixed use, but high-scale residential there in that brown shaded area to our east. So the proposed rezoning to RX5 recognizes that this property is a land use transition, and it also recognizes the fact that this area could become much more connected with the city growth center east of the CSX line in the future. This is a concept plan that kind of anticipates how the applicant envisions the site to be developed. You can see the tree conservation area in the middle, recognizing the Neuse River stream buffer. There's also a wetland boundary along Round Rock Drive. Also note the connection, the completion of Round Rock Drive, as I mentioned. Because of all the site constraints, because of the right-of-way dedication, the applicant is going to need to use the full 9 acres to locate 160 units on the site. But the good thing about that is it really does break up the massing. It spaces out those buildings. It doesn't feel as imposing to either the church or to the adjacent apartments to our north. And again, we've got 109 feet of right-of-way between this property and the single-family houses across Litchford Road. I'll also note the tree conservation area on the western boundary of this site along Litchford Road. Litchford Road, again, that avenue 4-lane divided street designation, it's classified as a thoroughfare under the UDO, which is going to require us to dedicate a TCA of at least 50 feet wide along Litchford Road. So as it relates to buffering from the lowest scale residential uses, I think that this rezoning and this this development of a vacant site is going to accomplish that solely through the requirements in the UDO. There were some concerns at our neighborhood meetings about the increased traffic that could result from this project. Obviously, it's vacant now, so it doesn't generate any traffic, but I did want to compare what we're proposing against what's in place today. So the top chart is the development intensity chart under existing and proposed zoning. And while we are increasing the residential development potential, we're significantly decreasing the office and retail that could be built on this site, and we're eliminating the industrial uses altogether. So we think that this proposed rezoning can create a more compatible development with surrounding uses than the current zoning can. That bottom chart, let's see if, how do I get this to drop down? Menu. There we go. This bottom chart shows the expected changes in daily traffic, peak AM, peak PM traffic under proposed and current zoning. This rezoning actually would generate significantly less traffic, both on a daily and peak hour trips than the current zoning that's in place, which is again that IX3 and RX6 split zoning. So this rezoning permits increased housing variety and complementary commercial uses along a thoroughfare. It serves as a land use buffer from the existing industrial uses to the north and the single-family homes across Litchford Road to the west. The topography of the site, the required location of the TCA, the expected building placement, spreading those buildings out amongst the entirety of the parcel is going to lessen the impact of a 5-story height allowance. This request is consistent with the 2030 comprehensive plan. It's compatible with the surrounding area, and it's reasonable and in the public interest. We appreciate your time this morning and look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Just want to check if there are members of the public who wish to speak on this item. Seeing none, I'll move on to questions or comments from commissioners. Commissioner Bennett.
Thank you. What is, how many stories are the apartments that are adjacent to this site?
I think the apartments to our north, I believe, are 2 stories, and I can't confirm the height of the southern apartments, although those aren't directly adjacent to us.
Okay. I think my primary concern about this one is just the height, and that the staff report notes that because this site is in an area with high levels of transit, the request for 5 stories is inconsistent with moderate scale residential. I mean, the site would allow for 3 or 4 stories, but 5 is inconsistent. That's my primary concern with this. Other than that, I don't see it as a bad request. It's just that notation about the 5 stories that concerns me.
Understood. And for what it's worth, I think it's important, again, to recognize what this site looks like today and what the buildings would look like from Litchford Road across the street. Again, it's a significant slope change from Litchford into the interior of this site. And so I don't think that these buildings are going to appear, at least from Litchford, as, a typical 5-story structure. As it relates to the apartments to the north, we could look at potentially increasing buffering or limiting building height within a certain distance of adjacent uses, if that would accomplish or address the concerns that the commission has.
I see some nodding, just to confirm that for you. Yeah, I believe the distance, reducing the height within a certain buffered area might make the most sense in this particular project.
Is it of the priority being these 2 properties to the north?
I would assume yes, given their proximity and what I'm thinking the grade is doing on the subject parcel. I'm not particularly concerned to the south or towards Litchford, based on where the TCAs were shown in your exhibit.
Right, and we had a condition at our initial submittal about tree conservation along Litchford Road. Staff told us that what we proposed was less strict than what the UDO would require, so we went ahead and removed it and followed along the UDO guidelines. But again, I think there is potential for height reductions closest to these 2 northern buildings. Obviously, this area along our northern boundary looks fairly open and void of buildings. I think we would just have to look at the impacts to that northernmost building. But happy to to consider that and work with the applicant on an updated condition.
Excellent. Commissioner
I
O'Haver?
was going to say, I think that's really looking at the development pattern along Litchford. I do think there's a potential that the scale of the buildings could be mitigated by the grade, but I can't tell it just from the GIS map. So I think that'd be my major concern. If you can demonstrate that the scale would be mitigated through the TCA and the grading, I don't think I have an issue, but there really isn't any 5-story development all along Litchford Road. So I think that'd be my biggest concern.
To be clear, are you asking for an exhibit perhaps, or?
I'm not asking, I'm just suggesting that it might be helpful. I have a sense that the applicant's a little hesitant to reduce his client's ability to maximize the potential value of the land by reducing the number of stories. So I'm just suggesting that perhaps something like that might mitigate some of the Planning Commission's concerns.
That would be helpful.
And we've got a couple weeks where we can see if there's an elevation that they've been working on. Obviously, that doesn't have to be in any sooner than the conditions. So we can work on addressing height as it relates to the 2 properties to the north, and see if we can bring back an exhibit that illustrates how those buildings might appear from Litchford Road.
Excellent. Thank you. So if there's no other discussion required, we are going to defer this item to our April 25th meeting, which now has a very, very robust agenda.
Some of them, hopefully, though, coming back should be easy if they meet the.
Okay. That actually concludes all of our discussion items for today. And so next is the approval of the minutes. Draft meeting minutes from the March 28th Planning Commission meeting are included in the backup. If there are any comments or edits, please make yourself known at this time. And if not, I'd like to entertain a motion.
Chair Fox, I'd like to move to approve the March 28th, 2023 Commission meeting minutes.
Excellent. And is there a second? Commissioner Rains has offered a motion to approve the minutes, and Commissioner Bennett has offered a second. There's no additional discussion. By show of hands, those in support and any opposed, that motion passes unanimously. Moving on to other business, report of the chair. No report, but a question of staff. I've noticed recently at a council meeting, and then also within the report of the assistant director, there are a couple of cases that are noted that they are going through a development agreement. Is there any additional information you could provide about that? What a development agreement is, perhaps for those who don't know, and what types of things sometimes show up in development agreements?
Sure. I see David also picking up his microphone. Do you want to lead, Mr. York?
I'm happy to. I was told to talk into the mic, although I don't know it's on. Development agreements are statutorily recognized agreements that cities can enter into with developers. It doesn't have to be in conjunction with the rezoning. It can be independent of rezoning. The 2 in question, and if you recall, some of you were on the commission when we adopted a development ordinance or a development agreement ordinance, added a process for approval of development agreements in our Chapter 10 of the UDO. There is a development agreement being worked on for Z3822, which was up just north of Buffalo Road. It was adjacent to the Forestville Road Park land that hasn't been developed, and it deals with developer contribution to the planning and development of that park and so forth. Then there's, and I can't remember the zoning case, but the Smoky Hollow case.
Z5422.
Yeah, Z5422, they're looking at a development agreement, again, in conjunction with the park that's adjacent to those properties. For that one's going to be more involved than the first one. But so it enables a property owner or a developer to obtain extended vested rights, sort of start the clock on where the rules are when you enter into the agreement, so that if there's changes in the UDO afterwards, the date of the agreement triggers the rules you have, although you still have permit choice and can choose revisions that you wish to. But also deals with, for example, in the Smoky Hollow, it would be a multi-phase development and triggering public improvements, who's responsible for making those public improvements and so forth. The Smoky Hollow one is in its early stages, and I think the goal is for staff to bring back a term sheet to council in the next two meeting cycles, I think. I don't know if
that answered my question. No, that was very helpful. I bring it up because I know a local municipality uses development agreements to obtain affordable housing. So it's through a development agreement process versus through a conditional use rezoning process. And it appears as an outsider to be a more effective tool to achieve affordable housing. So that's why that was more my curiosity. And perhaps if one might note in future rezonings where a development agreement might be appropriate, say in a TOD area, that we might be able to provide that type of information or recommendation. Anyway, moving on to report of the members. Oh,
Just a quick follow-up on that. That doesn't reverse anything that's been approved by the commission or the council, right?
Report of the members. We're going to go down the line, but considering Vice Chair Miller is out, I'm going to note that the next Committee of the Whole meeting is Wednesday, April 26th, in the chambers. I believe it's noted in the report from the Assistant Director in a different location, but please note it is on a Wednesday, which is a different day than it normally occurs. That is the 26th, and it is in the chambers in this room. And then we'll just go down the line.
Thank you. We are not, Infrastructure and Mobility is not meeting on April 27th. We'll meet again in May. Is that correct, Bynum? Thank you. And Chair Fox, thank you for that information about development agreements and what we may or may not note as we discuss rezonings.
No, it was a value add.
We appreciate the value add.
I don't have a report, but I also have a question, and perhaps this would be just a quick comment from staff, or maybe we could follow up at the Strategic Planning Committee. I've been reading and noticing folks talking about a noted drop in residential addresses in our urban areas in the state. So in a lot of the rezoning cases we come up, the neighborhood proponents will mention these statistics that show that our zip codes in our urban areas have lost folks. More folks have moved out of those zip codes than have moved in. And so it seems counterintuitive to what I'm seeing on the ground with all the development and the new housing going in. And I was wondering if is it a statistical anomaly? Is this a real phenomena that's occurring and expected to continue, and how it might impact our thinking about planning for the future for our urban areas? I didn't know if anybody else had heard that statistic at all yet.
I'd be happy to bring back some information in the Assistant Director's report at the next meeting.
The next text change meeting is at One Exchange Plaza on April 19th. Looks like we have two items to consider. Re-looking at the mobile retail and then protective yards.
No report. Unfortunately, I've got conflicts both for text change and with the change on cow. I will be out of town that day.
No report for me, but similar to that, I know that we worked hard to schedule that 26th meeting. Do we still? I've had something come up that will require me to be out of town when that happens as well. So I don't know if we still have a quorum. I know.
Yeah. We might have to circle the wagons outside of this meeting just to verify a quorum.
I also have a meeting, which I've notified. So, nothing on strategic planning. No comments from me as a member. Although I think I'd be curious as well about any housing opportunities for discussion in the strategic planning. I know you want some clear directive from us, so perhaps we can connect as a commission and discuss, some topics that we could explore, because I do think that some of the statistics are a little bit off from what we're seeing. And I know I've been curious about, for example, number of rezonings versus permitting activity and that sort of thing. And I know that with the potential inventory, it's actually affecting appraisals, which is then affecting the ability to get financing for projects because there's such a pipeline. And but it's bottlenecked right now. So units are not actually being able to be delivered from a financing standpoint because those units are not actually there to show the capacity. So just something that we can talk about perhaps and explore.
Excellent. And next report of the Assistant Director.
I don't have anything to add beyond what's in the agenda. I do want to apologize for the quality of the content of this agenda. It was not up to snuff, and we will do better.
I also want to note it looks like Board Docs is yelling at us with its giant font now.
Board Docs, a diligent brand, has made some recent upgrades to their software that make formatting somewhat uncontrollable by staff. It is delightful.
All right, on that note.
Actually, I do have a thing. I have a roster of membership. I would love it if you would look at your personal entry and make any corrections. It's really helpful if I can actually get in touch with you. And similarly, that you can get in touch with me. So,
all right, perfect. Thank you.
I just wanted to clarify, no strategic planning committee meeting Thursday,
Correct. All right, thank you. All right, if there's nothing else for the good of the order, Commissioner Raines.
I just want to thank Shanitha for the Easter.
Oh, thank you, Ms. Shanitha. All right, that concludes our meeting of the Planning Commission.